Welcome to Renaissance Charge Videos. I'm Rick Friedrich. Today, we've got something interesting. No demonstrations here, but very important content. So before I get into the historical electrical context of radiant energy that Tesla was born into, I will jump ahead to the historical electrical context of what I was born into in this research, and which is part of that primary Crookes Tesla radiant energy context. So we'll be talking about that in the future because people don't know the history, as I found out. They don't know why Tesla used that word, and we're going to focus on Bedini today in a positive context. So the best representative document that I can look back to is the following paper by Bearden. I printed it up here, called Explanation of John Bedini's Formation of Negative Resistors in Batteries. Now I will probably provide a link for this and you can follow along, although I'm not going to be reading all of it, just highlights and making some comments. So Bedini used the term radiant energy repeatedly, but few people understood the historical context, which we will later look at. So I think a lot of people, the way John came across was very, I was going to say ghetto kind of talk and abrasive. So they didn't really take him very seriously. I mean, he wasn't actually as original as Bearden is making him out in this paper. I don't think that John, was who he claimed. Nevertheless, this information is useful, and so I'm presenting it. Anyway, he used the term radiant energy, and the word radiant today means something pertaining to heat, unless you're working in different, like a radar context and different kinds of radiation. And that's really what we'll be getting into later on, not in this video. So we will start with this paper, which jumps right into the specific processes used to generate free energy in a battery and a circuit. The format in this paper here that you'll see a PDF is, in the size and color was added by Bedini. Now you can see the link on his webpage, icehouse.net/John1, which doesn't exist. I don't think icehouse.net even exists, but you can go to the webarchive.org, which I'll provide a link for. Now, so I've selectively also highlighted with an underline what I want to highlight in that paper. So on John's page, he's adding all these bigger and smaller font and color, which is important for you to look at and consider. This is like John's organizing of it. Anyway, the underlining is important, what I am stressing. And I will underline that here. I'll be emphasizing the underlining here. Now, what I want to say is this whole paper isn't pertaining merely to the monopole. You have to think in terms of John's first patent on motor systems, and that is a different motor than most people are used to. In fact, I didn't really see anybody replicate that motor. And it's quite interesting in itself. So some of that information in this paper pertains to that motor in some specifics. But there are hundreds of different models that we made. John made his own, I made my own later on. And others obviously before John made these things that he takes credit for, or took credit for. So there was a whole bunch of shuffling around of charges and processes. And this is going to get into the basics of that. I mean, it might sound advanced, but it's still the very basics. I think it'd be too advanced for a lot of people. But I think some of you who aren't interested in any advance, those of you who want the light switch only, then you'll still gain something from this. Maybe understand more why the light switch works. Who knows? So anyway, let's go on here. Now please pay attention to this, as it doesn't just relate to the motor and battery systems, but to every electrical system, every free energy system, and even every conventional system. Part of the application of this teaching here relates to Don's dipole generator with the plasma columns also, because we're getting into the heavy side a little bit, not much. But nevertheless, we're getting into enough that pertains to that system specifically. So this is both motor and solid state. So I stumbled upon the scene a few years after this was published in 2000 and immediately experienced some results with very crude models. Or the same results, I should say. One battery ran a little motor that had a rotor of 2 CD discs and 4 of those Briggs and Stratton magnets glued together, and a secondary battery was charging at the same time and at the same rate the other was discharging. Now this was a little 9-volt battery. One was completely dead, alkaline, and the other one was charged. And I'll post a link to it. There is a video of it. Again, you have to go through, well no, it's on my rpmgt.org website. So this was my very first free energy video, by the way. I just looked at it after years. I haven't seen it. It's buried on my old web pages. I've got a lot of old videos there. I don't even know where they are. I'd have to look through the thousands of pages. And my truthandheart.com website's been down for a year, so you have to use the archive if you want to go on that one. So how could that dead 9-volt battery charge up at all, I wondered. How was I getting extra charge from nothing? But actually the question assumes a wrong context. The better question is, how is any circuit powered at all? So starting with the quotes from here in the second paragraph. So again, it's called Explanation of John Bedini's Formation of Negative Resistors in Batteries, Tom Bearden, April 26, 2000. Both of these men are dead now. So I don't know of anybody actually teaching on this subject any further, so I might be the last one. And that's kind of why I'm sharing this right now. This paper, as it was on John's website, is not on the internet except for the archive. And there are somebody who's redone some of the pages, but they didn't do the John 1 page. And there's a couple of other ones. There's an interesting one that's related to this paper by Energetics, which was John and Gary's company. And they talk about the processes even more. So that's also important. And of course, there's a lot of internal stuff that I have that nobody else has, or at least that I know of anymore. So let's go into this. Vacuum energy already powers every electrical circuit and every electrical load today, and always has done so from the beginning. That's a pretty sweeping statement. Now, whether you believe in, this is my comment now, whether you believe in the vacuum as that word is implied by Bearden is not so much the point, although definitions are important and meanings are more important, but people use different language, and I'm not hung up on language. So people could use the terms ether or specifically mean different things. So we need to get beyond stumbling about words and look at the actual meaning that was trying to be portrayed here in basic concepts. So that is a claim. I challenge anybody to prove the opposite. Where is the energy coming from, like I asked the question? How can anything be powered at all? Where's it coming from? So he goes on, he says, contrary to the received view, extraction of usable EM, electromagnetic energy, from the vacuum is the easiest thing in all the world to do, and is ubiquitous to all our circuits and power systems. All the coal, oil, and natural gas ever burned in power plants added not a single watt to the power line. I remember when I first heard that, I was like, wow, how can that be? And just amazed. All that energy input from the fuel combustion was only used to continuously restore the source dipoles in the generators. Dipoles that our scientists and engineers unwittingly design the external circuits to keep destroying. So you have this charge that's a source that's powering loads, but because of the way the circuit is laid out in a closed loop, it destroys itself faster than it can power. So in other words, it's really inefficient and it's self-destructive. The source dipole, once established, was and is a negative resistor. So what's positive resistance? It's dissipative energy lost across the resistance. Like you think of a resistor or a light bulb, or even a coil, as we just talked about in the last video, or one of the last videos. You have a electron flow through the resistor, and you have heat as a side effect, and the energy is passing through the circuit, and there's a side effect of heat. Now people think that that resistive load is consuming the energy, and that the energy is going out from there. Now, sure, heat energy is being produced as a result. That was the subject of the other video that we talked about. But negative resistance is the opposite, in that energy converges in to the circuit itself. So it becomes almost like a source dipole in itself, but the energy converges in. So that's what this paper is all about. The negative the battery becomes a negative resistor. But we're going to focus on the specific place now and how it happens. And I've seen it with my own eyes. No. This is going to be another point that there needs to be careful distinctions made and careful observations made. And I can guarantee that everyone who's listening to this has never made those observations or never even thought to make them. And you've made assumptions, which we're going to get into, and I'm going to try and correct. Because I'm a philosopher more than a electrical guy. And I see in philosophy how failure to make distinctions leads to great error. Now, of course, most scientists, probably almost all of them today, are not philosophically oriented at all, and therefore make numerous fallacies without even realizing it. So we need to make careful distinctions, and we need to look at things. We need to get beyond the oscilloscope, okay? Those of you who live and die by your oscilloscope, you are limiting yourself. So, going on, this is my comment here. This point that I just read from Bearden needs to be fully understood, or you'll be flying blind and have no basis for this research. I'm talking about free energy research, or even evaluating the motor systems, because this pertains specifically to the motor systems that I make and that I have made for almost 18 years now. I'm not concerned with the exact wording or view of how this takes place, but we have to think logically and make careful distinctions to realize this. This will be your aha moment when the whole world will open up for you. Like I said previously, when you get this point, then everything makes sense. But I'm sure with most of you, perhaps all of you, it's still foggy in your head. And he goes on to say specifically, and it kind of jumps around here. I guess I could try and tell you which page we're on here. Still on page 1. Specifically, that little change, symmetrical regauging after the first Lorentz in 1867, and later H.A. Lorentz, another Lorentz, simply discards all open Maxwellian systems far from thermodynamic equilibrium from the active vacuum. So this is an important historical omission fact here. So I always show Maxwell's book at my meetings. I just happen to have it right here on the shelf. So there's Maxwell's book, original book, right? James Clerk Maxwell. I always show with the page open to the free energy equation, page 27. Equation of free electricity. And Maxwell didn't have it all right either, but he did have more, and they got rid of the more that ended up being problematic for the systems that people wanted to promote. Excuse me, my chair here. So let's go on from Bearden. First, to understand John's work, one must be aware that there are several currents in a lead acid battery, not just one. Still on the first page. For our purposes, we will need just two. The heavy lead type ion current in the battery and the electron current in the battery, but also commuting into the electric external circuit, I should say. So you have electron in the battery and in the circuit that is pertaining to what we're talking about in this paper. So notice that first, consider that. People are only focusing on electrons and not the other part of the process here. Note particularly that the electrons communicate between the inside of the battery, example the plates, and the external circuit, but, okay, so it does too, but the lead ions do not. There is thus an interface and a sharp separation between the electron current and the ion current. Here's the point everyone is missing. Check the mass to charge ratio of each of the two currents. Can you do that yourself? Well, you can at least think about it. So this pertains to other systems as well besides battery systems. And that, again, some of this will relate to what I talked about in the Resonance 2 kit. Anyway, this is a fundamental distinction with regards to time. People don't have access to measure such things and generally lump everything together to their own misunderstandings. We will make similar distinctions with regards to initial switch turn on event. It's an event, I would like to talk about it as an event. And the turn off event here. And few people pay attention for the same reasons. So what happens is people look at their oscilloscope or even just maybe their voltmeters and they go and say, this is what's happening. And then they go and say, this is all that's happening. It's like a 4-year-old child who starts to learn some things and he feels smart, that he knows the world. He gets in front of his friends and acts like he knows it all. And that's the tendency that people have, is because they're impatient and they're not thorough, and they just assume that what they know is all they need to know, or all that there can be. It's a pride. So in this case, we're seeing on the oscilloscope, well, first on the voltmeter, all we're seeing is the voltage, because the voltmeter is not telling you, keeping fast enough with the pulsing to show you up and down, whereas the oscilloscope is at least showing you, mind you, think about it, the oscilloscope is only its own circuit. So it is a reaction to what's taking place. It is not what's taking place. The screen is not, it's trying to give you an indication of what is happening. When you understand the thing in itself, and you're used to working with the oscilloscope, you can get an idea. But don't confuse the readings on the oscilloscope with what is actually happening, right? So that's a big part. I was going to get into a big philosophical discussion on that, but I won't. So here we have the case where on the oscilloscope you have the turn on and the turn off. So you were going by, you're reading the voltages and perhaps the amperages on the oscilloscope, and you're making some conclusions by that. Well, if you're just looking at that, it's not going to tell you what this whole paper is about. And that's why we're getting into it. So we tried to say, Bedini did and I did for years, and continue to do so, that the switch turn on is different than the switch turn off. So we're going from the MOSFETs or the transistors, semiconductors, reed switches, or whatever you have, being off. Say this is the motor or solid state, doesn't matter. So you have the turn off, and then you turn on. Now, if you're doing a AC sine wave, then you're turning on slower. You don't have a sharp gradient pulse, an impulse. Now, this is not DC again. This is not AC. It is impulse, unidirectional, one-directional impulse. AC or DC is constant current, unchanging, stabilized, right? This is not that. This is an impulse. So we turn on the pulse. We turn on, which is a pulse, and what happens at that instant before the current can flow? What happens? Or before electrons can move, even. So we're going to get into that shortly. And then, what's the difference between that and the turning off? This is primarily about the first phase of this process, the turn on. Not the continuous on so much, but the initial turn on. So it's sloppy work to jump to a conclusion based upon a mere oscilloscope reading. Because what's happening is, what you come into the subject with is what you're going to go out with. Now, unless you are reserved like I am in your judgments, then you end up in a circle of reasoning. You end up putting out into your conclusion your assumed premises that haven't been justified. So this becomes reductionism, and it becomes oversimplification. You have put in too little inputs into the situation to make the proper outcome. And I'll talk about an example of that happened right on this YouTube channel just the other day. And of course, we have to be realistic that we do this all the time, unintentionally. I think in most cases, it's a sin to allow yourself to do that. Other times, you honestly believe something and you've done thorough research, you've been misled, or what have you. So we can err in many things innocently, but people don't live that way. They live, they deliberately, knowingly live in a state of confirmation bias. And that's why I've stressed that subject so much. So anyway, let's go on to the subject of the two different currents is the word in the lead acid battery. What is the result of that? So there is obviously a hysteresis, which is time delay. in response to the massive ion current to far less massive electron currents that interact, and try to change the ion current and its momentum. This time delay in ion response to electron urging can be adroitly manipulated to and used to cause the vacuum to add energy to the ions and also to the electrons. So this is very important concept in technology and especially in free energy. In short, the delay can be manipulated to freely regauge. Now this paper gets more into the regauging, gives you reference. The delay can be manipulated to freely regauge the system, freely changing its potential energy, and dramatically increasing how much potential energy is available for battery recharging and how much is available for powering the external circuit loads and losses. So understanding this is the first stage to doing a system that self-runs and creates excess power, excess outputs, and also then can be infinitely multiplied. So you can have a prime mover that keeps on producing as many additions that you add to it. You can keep on producing more and more, not just infinite and continuously outputting, because that's a form of infinite, so long as your parts would last, but these are not consumable parts, really. So this hysteresis is everything here and important in other systems as well. This is potential time, right? Time potential. So this is a big thing with Bedini. He left all these little clues on his website. You can see one time he put this little pendulum up there, and it was all for me to try and figure out, which I always did the next day after he put it up and told him, you know, what you're trying to say. But resting periods is what we're going to get into here. Now these are very short resting periods, but some of them can be longer. So instead of thinking of energy, the energy John inputs into the battery as the powering energy, one must think of it as triggering and timing energy, which initiates certain other key interactions to occur. These additional interactions then add lots of additional energy to the ions and the electrons, all for free or nearly so. In short, John switches and triggers certain kinds of vacuum interactions. So that means interacting with the ether or ambient back and forth in the circuit, including the highly specialized formation of a negative resistor in the battery itself. He then triggers that negative resistor in certain ways to increase its functioning even further. So we move away from the idea of output energy equaling or coming from the operator input, but rather a triggering method. Like the analogy I give about pricking a giant with a needle to affect mass movement, a movement of mass, big mass, or causing an avalanche with the snap of a finger, or a baby crying and parents come running. A little bit of trigger. Does the baby catch on to that manipulation? Eventually, maybe. We just have to create a potential with a little effort. So that's the key. We can do this in various ways, create a potential, if we know that we're actively affecting the vacuum, which we'll talk about later, then we can do a whole lot more. We can realize we can do more with it by just creating a little disturbance. Just like sound can, someone can scream alarm and it gets everybody running, like the baby crying. So he talks about here, this triggering can be done in multiple ways, not just one way, to bring in more energy and to power more loads within the circuit, externally to the circuit, in this case the battery as well. Suppose, he says further, suppose we hit a battery's terminals with an instantaneous leading edge rise of a pulse of electrons and potential. The beginning of the square wave. Let us assume the hit is the battery charging mode, is in the battery charging mode. The electrons drive in instantly, trying to force the heavy ions to start moving in the charging direction. For a moment, the lead ions just sit there, and then very slowly, compared to the electrons, start to reluctantly move in the recharging mode. Now he describes this in this paper as the same thing as when you slap your hand on water. So normally if you could dive in to water, you can go right into it with little resistance. Now a bullet supposedly goes 700 times slower through water than through air. But with your hand, boom, that's why if you fall off a bridge onto the water, you don't want to land like that. You want to go feet first. But you don't want to have your feet like that. You want to have your feet toe down. So anyway, you slap that, you have this resistance. Boom! It's got really nowhere to go, the water. So in the same way, you hit this, you hit a brick wall. And in a later video, I'll get into doing this with a coil. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on in this too. So the electrons for a moment they can't go anywhere. They start to reluctantly move in the charging mode. It's like the whipping the slave that doesn't want to work. And we're going to talk about that too in a minute. During that ion response lag time, the electrons continue to furiously rush in and pile up on the plates. So you have this difference of time between the two things, and which I don't actually believe are happening exactly the way the conventional theory holds to, because I have no way of really verifying it. But we have these, according to this understanding here, two different times that we can, is most likely accurate here. But you have two different times, and so the one builds up faster than the other. And it does more things for you. The charge density sharply increases on the plates in that pile up where the charges are squeezing together, clustering. We're talking about electrons here. Filled in. So now we have a much higher potential suddenly rising in the squeezed charge cluster. because of the increased charge density arising there. This is very important. Okay, you can see a spike on the oscilloscope. So that might give you an indication, but have you realized what was happening in the plates? Well, have you thought about the difference between those, the ions and the electrons? So notice this is my comments now. Notice this is the leading edge, not the collapsing coil, which is the second phase of this process. This is the same thing we will get into with the Tesla effect. In this context, we are still doing that with the coil itself. So we're doing it with the battery and the coil. But here we are merely focused on the battery. Both resist change in the same way, while something special happens with the charge effect. So a coil resists change with that leading pulse, right? There'll be no current flow, it'll just kind of stop, boom. And then the same thing with this battery. So of course conventional theory says when the electrons are enough, when there's no movement, then there's nothing beneficial. Right? We have to wait until there's movement. That's not what we'll be getting into something totally different than that later on as well, beyond this paper. No textbook or professor ever calculates the potential itself, but only its reaction cross-section. Consider that for a while. It's quite rigorous. We have been and are taught to calculate only how much energy is diverged from the potential around a little unit of point static charge assumed, and that little swirl around energy is then supposed to be the potential. It isn't. Of course, it gets into that more here. It's a historic example of circle reasoning and the fundamental fallacy of the entire electrical world. On my YouTube channel the other day, some guy was causing trouble by continually asking for the amp reading going to the charging battery. I answered him extensively that the battery is part of the internal system, and therefore it was misleading to evaluate the system based upon that reading, when we're really only interested in what the battery can put out over time after it's been charged. Or you could probably do it in some context while it's being charged. Not that we recommend that. In some ways we do. Also, the battery is a negative resistor during that time. So the energy is coming in to it, right? It's not going out. And you can actually see some of that with the amp meters, that they're giving you the opposite. So even if you had an amp meter reading, it's not going to be indicative of what happens in that battery over time. But nobody wants to take the time to charge up a battery and see what you can get out of it and understand their battery enough to know its real capacity, what to expect to get out of it over time. Which is what we did on the monopole groups, monopole 1, 2, and 3, and other various groups that I started back in 2005 and 6 and 7. So we did that. We had people cycle their batteries, charge them up, discharge them, get to know them, get acquainted with them, name them, talk to them, feed them. Now we told them, get used to understand the real capacity of your battery, because you might have a 100 amp hour battery that only has 1 amp hour of real capacity in it. And don't misjudge that battery because it's sulfated. Anyway, once you understand your battery, then charge it up under the charging rates that you're using. We did at least 10 cycles to get a feel for the batteries. Then you know what to expect. You know its relative amp hour capacity. So this was a proper controlled test. It was hard enough to get people to do that. But you could never get the electrical engineers to do that because they're arrogant, almost every one of them. And I think I wanted to be an electrician, and I became an auto mechanic instead. Probably a good thing. I always focused on the electrical side of auto mechanics, and then here I am now. But the problem is, for some reason or other, these guys become very arrogant, and they're unteachable, and they're completely useless. You know, sure they can charge you extra money for making you do more things on your house. That's what we've experienced. But they're hopeless. Now, of course, a lot of you are my customers who are electricians, so you're maybe the 5% that are open. But yeah, they won't even consider. They'll have a meter on there, or they'll heard something from somebody that's not true, and they won't give it 5 minutes. Anyway, back to our battery that we just popped with an electron pulse. Now we have a higher potential in that pileup of electrons into the interface with the ions, using the ions forward, urging the ions forward. Well, the potential energy being collected on those ions, i.e. diverged around them from the potential's multiwaves, is given by W, which is watts, equals feet in the Greek letter, where W, or phi, sorry, where W is the energy collected from the new and dramatically increased potential with reaction cross section phi upon charges Q, or it's shaped like a Q. In this case, upon the ions. And also upon piled up electrons in the circuit side of the battery plate, because the waves comprising the potential run in both directions. So he gets more into all that, explains it. But here's where we see the potential difference appear, just like we have been focusing on other setups with different types of grounding circuits in the Resonance 2 kit. So we're piling up electrons in unique ways, one-wire circuits. This is a one-wire circuit, by the way. So we can think of it after the diode in these motor circuits going to the positive terminal of the charging battery, or the negative terminal of the charging battery back to the front end of the coil. You can do that there too. But we have this one-wire circuit there, and the battery is part of that as well. So then he goes and says, set a potential in the middle of a transmission line, and it takes off like two scalded hogs in both directions simultaneously. And then a similar statement, I'm jumping down a little bit. But that increased potential at the pileup, going back to the battery here, is actually a change to the ambient potential of the vacuum. Now in the Resonance Kit 2 book, we talk about circuits that oscillate back and forth to an antenna, in which create a change in the local ambient. So this needs to be considered We have focused on the changing of the local ambient in a minor way in the second kit, but this claims a much bigger change is taking place in the whole entire vacuum of the universe. Everything is affected. Now that's something I couldn't quite understand initially when I heard that, and now it makes more sense. So it's kind of like thinking of the spiritual realm being everywhere, but not anywhere in a sense. So it's not spatial related. You know, it's a different, like, where is your mind? Where is your will? Where is your sensibility? It's not in your brain. You know, people think your feelings are in your heart area. Well, that would be where you feel something. And your mind is where you have it's the organ that is different than the determination factor. There is no will in a material thing. You have memories in your brain and in different parts of your body, apparently. So anyway, I'm rambling on. Okay, for the purist, jumping on the next point, for the purist, electrons really move on the average with only a very small drift velocity in the circuit, often on the order of a few inches per hour. However, that average drift is comprised of enormous distribution of electron velocities, collisions, etc. So what we have actually done is dramatically change that distribution underlying the drift velocity. Okay, I'll explain in a second. The current, well, it's already been explained. The current in a circuit is not as simple as the physical movement of electrons like marbles through a hollow pipe, even though loosely one usually uses that kind of language. So this is vastly important. No, that's what I wrote. This is vastly important for many systems. At my meetings, I sometimes give the example with a video of the klystron electron bunching in a similar context. If you type up klystron in Google or YouTube and you look at the videos, you'll see this old one from like the 1950s. Don't look at the newer one. It's the one that actually I use in the Don Smith book, with the picture and everything. There's a difference between drifting and bunching, as we see in Don Smith's grounding system as well. We have to make these distinctions and move past the basic understanding of circuits. So, in that klystron video, you see it well illustrated, very slowly. You have the electron beam, and you're showing the drift, which you have the drift rate like this, so to speak, one set of timing, but then you have in that the electrons get they get the first resonant cavity initiates the beginning phase of the bunching. So you've got these kind of random electrons in the beam coming through, and it's timed so much that the electrons start bunching, and these patterns here, they start coming together, and by the time they get to the second resonant cavity, then they're more organized, just like here. So it's exactly the parallel analogy to what's happening in the battery. And our timing that we want to do, so which is actually a slow time, ideally, is very little trigger energy, so it's not a motor, really, at all. it's a mechanical oscillator. So the oscillation needs to be timed, just like the klystron. For maximum efficiency, the input energy, in the klystron's case, is a resonant cavity, so that is a gain system. And the output, by emission, is a total gain from the input. So the second, by the time that electron cluster gets fully mature, it's at its highest rate or formation. And so then you have the highest potential, and you take off of that, which the energy, again, think about it, is once you've created a potential, the energy is streaming in from the vacuum or the ether or whatever you want to call it. It's a gain. Otherwise, there would be no purpose of making this system at all. If it was just, like I say, if all you can get out is what you put into it, I could show you many devices that would be completely useless. But why would you bother? Why would you just have a transformer and be done with it? Step up the voltage and down with the amperage, if that's all you wanted to do. So, I mean, that's the most basic thing you should all realize. It's proven by the fact that people don't create these kinds of equipment for more losses. Right? Anyway, let's go on. The charges in the pileup took on more energy, as I just described, taken from the vacuum, and the higher potential also flows at the speed of light back out the terminals along the conductors, potentializing the surface charges and increasing the intercepted energy diverged into the conductors by the surface charges. Think about that for a second. Pause it, replay it, think it through. Since a backlash EMF exists from the higher potential at the pickup and the beginning potential at the external circuit, current flows in the external circuit 1 and circuit powering mode 2 with greater energy collected upon the electrons from the increased Poynting energy flow diverged into the circuit conductors. So now, Heaviside considered the whole, which he talks about in this paper, consider the whole flow of things. And Poynting was only focused on the divergent energy into the circuit. So the majority of the flow is external and is not intercepted by the circuit, but the Poynting flow, these are named after the people themselves. They came up with these at the same time. So this explains how there is more convergent energy flowing into all portions of the system, and why a larger surface area also allows for more gains, as I've said for years. This is where we begin to learn about the third stage process as well. You can see from the second PDF, which I'll probably include here, where both John and I were in the Tesla Impulse video talking about it in 2006. And John writes it on the board. And I was teaching about that on the groups. So there are a few examples shown along that path towards the positive terminal of the battery. Notice the one image where he says where it says positive energy. That's for another discussion. Because of the unique process, we can add more surface area while having the opposite result, which is negative resistance. So the opposite result, when you think of negative resistance, it's the opposite of positive resistance. So positive resistance is divergent energy, scattering energy, and negative resistance is convergent energy. Energy is pouring in. Now, I would believe that heat is energy flowing in to the resistor to allow for that to happen. It's a result of electron movement, as I said previous. But in this case, the resistor can become cold. And you could almost like consider a potentialized resistor. In this case, we're talking about the resistor of the battery. But we can also put a coil in there of various different configurations, which you see some of them in these pictures. That's what I'll probably do. I'll just input the pictures into the video. So, because of the unique process, we can add more surface area, which is negative resistance. So as we put up more sails, not like this with the wind, oops, but like this, we collect more wind. We add various kinds of circuits along this one wire path. We can multiply the process like Tesla and Benitez did. I have not found a limit when I have maxed out all the parts that I have had available, both in battery bank size and inductors and transformers. When you realize this, you will have an even bigger aha moment than with the first one. So, like I said before, that's what I asked Bearden. The first major question was, can we multiply this process out? And he said that. I remember standing in his hallway asking him that, and he said, yeah. And I said, can we use the existing infrastructure as well? And he said, yes. Like we could use the power lines and everything and make simple modifications to power all of our homes for free. But ideally, it would probably be just done with local systems and just kept all the same way. Local free energy systems. So there's a lot in this statement alone. All these points I could do videos on by themselves. So I'll move on. Note that the formation of the negative resistor actually produced in the external circuit a back EMF, which is of the circuit powering type, even though in the battery the ion current is still moving and accelerating in the charge position, exactly opposed to the electron current. Whoa, that's something to wrap your brain around. So that, again, did any of you think about that, who have not read this paper, because some of you have? Did any of you otherwise even fathom these kinds of details in this process? Or did you just either deny that there was any charging taking place at all, or just assume it was some kind of fairy that was just zapping the battery? Zoop, waving their wand. Then so hold on a second, did I finish reading here? Yeah. I just want to make sure I'm not missing a page. So I guess I could make some comments upon that too, but I pretty much did. So then we deliberately cut off the pulse sharply. So this is the second kind of phase in this process. The first phase is turn on, and I'm going to call the second phase turn off, even though you tend to think of that as one phase, and then if you had two phases on the motor circuits like we have on the window motor, you've got the on phase of the one coil, maybe another on phase going downwards. while that one was off, that one was on. We're going to talk about it as two different phases in the sense that in relation to the battery. So we push this battery in charge mode, and then what's going to happen is we deliberately cut off that pulse. This is the on time of the motor. This is the end of the square wave. But we do it sharply. We don't slowly go down like you have on some frequency generators where you get up to higher frequencies. It's basically more like a sine wave. Really dirty sine wave. With the ions now moving in the charge direction and with electrons in the external circuit powering the load, right? The sharp cutoff rate produces a very interesting effect here also. If we end it just precisely while most of the pile up and higher potential still exists at the plate ion interface. And I'll talk about this at the end here in more detail. In that case, Lenz's law applies due to the sharp cutoff, and it aids us, since momentarily the negative resistor potential is even further dramatically increased by the Lenz reaction. So even more potential energy momentarily surges out into the circuit, electrons in the powering circuit mode. And even more potential energy simultaneously surges onto the ions in the charging battery mode. Right? So there's two things going on here, at least. Two things going on here, and you have to understand both of them. And the timing is everything. That's what Bedini always said. Remember, he was right. They overshoot because of their sluggishness. This is the ions now. And keep on charging the battery a moment longer. One trick that John sometimes uses, or used, is to time the next pulse front, to arrive just at that time that the ions are almost, but not quite, stopped in their overshoot charging mode and are preparing to reverse into discharge mode. So think about it. Well, I already have all these comments that I made here, but so you're keeping them, you keep those ions moving, you start it off, get them moving in the first pulse, and then you're turning off, which is really another, I consider that the turning off like a turning on of this process. So the first one, and then both of them are not, well, there is some current flow at this point already. With after the first turn on, you have this movement that's kind of picking up momentum, as he says, and then you're turning off that as this movement is slowing down. So there's a whole science to figuring out exactly the ideal rate, and there's a lot of factors to consider. You don't have to be perfect in it to get good results, and I'll talk about that with my motors in a second. But let's just read what I said here instead of me adding more. This last point is what I've specifically developed in the ideal rest time. This is what a lot of my research has been focused on a long time ago. This relates to the first patent model with the long time delay between discharges. There's a little tiny model where John's running in the video, where you can see, and I did a video of that in 2005, which is on my channel here. So you have all these big gears on there. So he's pulsing a capacitor, and then he's discharging it once, I think it was like every 11 or 13 seconds or something. So that was for one particular purpose, to explain something. In that case, it was building up a charge enough to run that little light bulb so that you could see it lit. But when we think about that in relation to time delays, we'll get into that in a second here. It relates also to the short on time of the 10 coiler. This was John's motor. I did one like that, but we didn't sell it like that, where you had the two north poles pressed together with the two ceramic magnets, creating this beam, north pole sharp beam, which he called a scalar beam, which also allows for a longer off time between the poles. So you've got on this big rotor these two magnets pushed together. Instead of having them flat with the north pole facing out, bigger north pole, we have this sharp beam. It's very sharp on and off time or pulse, but between the two sets of magnets there is a longer off time. And then we also get into the whole pendulum concept as an application of this, because you got a pendulum going, taking maybe 1 second between each pulse. People don't want to wait for that kind of energy. So I've suggested more research to be done in determining maximum output from such a system, where charging a battery is left in charging mode due to the slow ion movement, so that the trigger input energy can be minimized to only be done as needed. Why be a slave ion more frequently than you need to idea? Right? Not that I recommend slavery, but you get the picture. Just to be clear here, we are usually talking about a relatively very short time period delay in these delays. However, I will stress that there are also much longer beneficial delays. I first noticed the following extraordinary result 6 years after I was into this tech, when I assembled the first 10 coiler, my first 10 coiler that you see in that infomercial. I had run it for only 5 minutes and had to attend to something else for a while, but I had measured it carefully when I stopped. Then I came back and I found the batteries kept on charging significantly more than when I left. It was really noticeable. Usually you only see the charging battery dissipate, have a high voltage reading while charging, and then come back down when turned off and continue to dissipate. Or just go, not dissipate really, but discharge, or the voltage come down. But here it increased after it stopped with real gain. So what I figured out over time, after that experience, I really looked into this more, the rest periods. What I figured out over time was that when batteries get conditioned to receive this kind of charging, then they could continue to charge for hours and even a day afterwards. However, when they stop, when the ions really stop moving, they begin discharging to some extent faster than normal discharging. So on a regular positively charged battery, you can have it sit quite a while on like a good quality battery, good conditioned battery. It will hold its charge, not with the negatively charged batteries. They will tend to, you got to use them. You don't use them, you lose them. This is what we can see with the old NiCad batteries that were only good for daily use. So we could restore those batteries but not prevent the self-discharge portion of it. So in this case, there's this whole local effect. We can get in this with Jerry Vassilatos' books, which I'll be going over more in the future, we have all these weird phenomena with this, direct ether energies. And so what happens is we can have a battery placed in a locale that becomes more receptive over time. We can have all this different weird phenomena that we're not used to, or we never paid attention to notice. And so, like Tesla could transmit through the air a signal, turn it off and remove, and the light would still be lit even after he's removing the device. Weird stuff like that. One of these days I'll do a demonstration of that. I always mean to get around to do that, and then I never get around to doing it at my meetings. If we were in Tesla's day, people would be jumping out the window when you do stuff like that because they would think that you're possessed or something. You're doing magic. Well, more than magic. That's supernatural or something. Well, in a sense, everything is supernatural because the natural is directly supernatural in itself. So there was a right timing to charge as well as a right kind of pulse. And like I said, we can manipulate the on time. If we want motor power, we have to consider both the motor and the charging, which is what I'm doing in my motors. I'm giving you, well, I'll talk about that in a second. So this is really this is really a low frequency and sharp gradient on and off. We're actually keeping the on time very short and the off time very much longer. As you can see, it's not about a motor at all. I just made it one while sacrificing all the potential gains that I could get out of it, because I don't need to do that. I didn't need the ideal because I can do the third stage process without big batteries or big coils. As people didn't want to use big batteries to get the maximum gains from such a process, I decided to do a similar compromise as I did with the window motor in using a small fraction of the wire that Newman used. So in both cases I used less wire with Newman and less battery with Bedini. See you later, Newman and Bedini. I decided to make something more practical by at least giving battery rotation at a basic level, the stage 1 process, and so power, and so only partly benefiting from this negative resistance process, while also providing the more desired motor power, which people could run a wasteful generator from, because that's all they wanted to really do. Kind of like the light switch idea. They didn't want to do this. After Bedini deleted all the lists and attacked me and closed down all this that she warned he was going to do for years, I realized that generally people weren't interested in what I'm saying today with all this. And so I just focused more on creating a basic self-runner that gives them some energy, not as much as they could have gotten with, like I said, Newman with the bigger wire and Bedini with the bigger batteries, which is both a lot more money. So again, it's a compromise. I'm trying to think of what's practical, and you can still do these processes. Like I said, the third stage process, as I called it, which doesn't have to be resonance. I know I've been saying that a long time. Resonance process, but it doesn't have to be. And once you understand how this works, it is really about the phasing. timing. And now you can see more detail. We'll get into, this is all still the basics. This is just kind of preparing that way for the engineering. It's opening the door so that you have confidence that you can do the engineering. Sure, you can see this battery charging, but what would you think was really happening? Right? How do these things all relate to each other? So you can see, as he said from the beginning, that it didn't, it's in perfect compliance with the laws of physics, thermodynamics, and conservation of energy law. Because the conservation of energy law is non-existent. Because really the context everybody has is in a closed context, which is the whole universe itself. Think about it. Okay, so there's no more gain or loss to the universe, but there's a whole lot of variety within the universe. So what's the point of even saying that? And how can you even prove that anyway? Anyway, I'll end there. Enough of my jokes.